Hey everyone, so today we'll be talking about reproductive physiology. So these are all the more low yield topics, so I'll just be going over the main points, and there's more details in the slides that I'll be putting up. So we'll start with fertilization and early life. So sperm from the epididymis are unable to fertilize until they undergo the capacitation reaction, and this occurs in the female reproductive tract. The reaction is needed so that the sperm can penetrate the zona pellucida, which is the covering that surrounds the egg. And capacitation results in two things: hyperactivated motility and the acrosome reaction. So we'll go through the acrosome reaction pathway now. So the zona pellucida consists of three glycoproteins. We don't really care about one, but it's 2 and 3 that you need to remember. So sperm first bind to ZP3, and that results in an increase in intracellular calcium, which leads to the acrosome reaction. And then the reacted sperm bind to ZP2. So that's just a summary slide. So now that the sperm has penetrated the zona pellucida, it has to fuse to the egg. So there are two proteins that are needed for this: CD9 for the eggs and isomer for the sperm. So both proteins are present in everybody, but you only need your respective protein. So fertilization can occur in females if the CD9 protein is present, regardless of whether the isomer protein is there or not. And then same for males. If males have isomer, they're good to go. Doesn't matter whether CD9 is present or not. Now that the sperm and egg have fused, the egg needs to be activated. So there are two parts to this. The first is cortical granule exocytosis. So basically, we need to stop more sperm from penetrating the zona pellucida so that they can't also try to fertilize the egg. So we do this by cutting off ZB2 and modifying ZP3. The second event is resumption of the cell cycle. So this involves the sperm head, which contains the DNA, inserting into the cytoplasm of the oocyte, an increase in intracellular calcium, and the activation of the egg. So now we'll move on to placentation and fetal growth. So the zygote now travels through the fallopian tubes to reach the uterus, and by the time it gets there, it's grown into a blastocyst. A blastocyst has three parts to it. It's got this outer layer, which is called the trophoblast, and that turns into the placenta. Then there's also the inner cell mass and a cavity, which is filled with fluid. The trophoblast layer splits into two layers. The inner layer is the cytotrophoblasts, and the outer layer is the syncytiotrophoblasts, which are involved in the decidualization response. So that's where the blastocyst buries itself in the uterine wall. That's like you can see in this bottom image here. The cells are invading so that it basically can't get sucked away. The trophoblast cells also produce HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin. That's a really important hormone because it signals to the corpus luteum to continue producing progesterone and estrogen, and both those hormones are really important for pregnancy. There are lots of implantation issues. The most common thing is just implantation failure. 2 out of 3 blastocysts actually fail to implant. Ectopic pregnancies is something that you should have heard about already. So that's when the blastocyst implants outside the uterus, usually in the fallopian tubes. And outside the uterus, there's just not enough room for the fetus to grow. So ectopic pregnancies are a medical emergency because a ruptured ectopic can lead to death. And the last one is placenta previa. This is when implantation occurs near the opening to the cervix. So the placenta may cover the opening to the vagina and it can separate before it's supposed to. So moving on to the placenta, there are 3 main functions. It provides nutrients and removes waste, it acts as an immunological barrier, and it synthesizes and secretes hormones. Most of these result from the placenta being permeable to certain substances, but not others. So alcohol, nicotine, drugs, and some maternal pathogens are all able to pass through the placenta. But large proteins, like hormones and the maternal immune system, they can't pass through the placenta. And the blood supplies are also separate. So while they might be in close proximity, the fetal blood supply and the mother's blood supply never mix. In terms of secretions, the placenta's production of progesterone and estrogen is the most important. So that's this red and black line here. So they've got a similar pattern in that they both increase towards the end of pregnancy, but the scales are very different. there's a much higher concentration of progesterone than estrogen. So there are lots of maternal adaptations to pregnancy, and there's a lot more detail on the slides, but these are the main ones you should remember. So the most obvious one is weight gain, so about 10 to 12 kilos. And you can also get insulin resistance, which is gestational diabetes. In terms of cardiovascular effects, cardiac output increases by 30 to 40%, and progesterone causes a decrease in total peripheral resistance. There's also a mild anemia because ECF and RBC both increase, but RBC doesn't increase as much as ECF increases. For respiratory, we have a compensated respiratory alkalosis. This is because there's an increase in O2 consumption, which leads to an increase in CO2 production, meaning there's an increase in ventilation and you're breathing out more CO2. So CO2 levels drop and there's an alkalosis. Now we'll move on to birth. So just before birth, there is a massive increase in cortisol levels. Cortisol is really important because it helps promote the development of organs, slow down growth, and it promotes secretion of surfactants in the fetal lungs. The surge occurs because the placenta produces CRH, which is a hormone normally produced by the hypothalamus in adults. And CRH activates the adrenal cortex to then produce cortisol. This is one of the rare occasions that there's a positive feedback loop. So the positive feedback loop means that we can have really high concentrations of cortisol. So the triggers of birth aren't exactly known, but what is known is that it's multifactorial. We do know that estrogen and prostaglandin levels have to rise during birth, and progesterone levels decrease. This is because during pregnancy, progesterone ensures that there aren't any contractions and that the cervical canal is closed. So it's kind of counterproductive during birth. We can also class them as uterotrophic and uterotonic factors. So uterotrophic factors prepare the uterus for contraction. Examples include estrogen. But uterotonic factors induce contractions. So examples are oxytocin and prostaglandins like PGF2 alpha and PGE2. So the Ferguson reflex is basically an oxytocin positive feedback loop. So this describes how contractions occur. So it starts with a baby pushing on the cervix and activating the receptors there. These receptors send signals to the hypothalamus, which synthesizes oxytocin, and that's released via the posterior pituitary. Then oxytocin causes the uterus to contract more vigorously, and it allows the baby to move deeper. And then there's continued activation of the receptors and more signaling, and basically the whole loop just keeps on going. So it's a positive feedback cycle. So that means that oxytocin is continuously released until the baby is born and there's no more pressure on the receptors. There are 3 stages to labor. The first stage is from onset of contractions to full dilation of the cervix. The second stage is when the baby is born, and the third stage is when the placenta is expelled. And after birth, lactation is very important. So before pregnancy, breasts are actually unable to produce milk. It's during pregnancy when progesterone and estrogen promote the growth of ducts and alveoli is where the milk is actually produced. Progesterone and estrogen also block the actions of prolactin during pregnancy. After birth, progesterone and estrogen concentration dramatically falls, so prolactin is no longer blocked. Prolactin is involved in galactopoiesis, so that's the maintenance of milk production. And then oxytocin is involved in milk letdown. So the release of oxytocin is stimulated by suckling and crying. So it's stimulated by suckling because when the baby is suckling on the nipple, it activates the receptors in the nipple. And so that directly sends signals to the hypothalamus and the release of oxytocin. And it's stimulated by crying because that's a conditioned response. So that's it for today. So feel free to message me if you have any questions, and you can check out the endo slides we have up if you want a bit more information on oxytocin. And thanks for listening.